Last week, a client of mine reached out to me because she's selling a property that's outside my market, and because I've worked with her on multiple transactions, she wanted me to look at the format of the other broker's listing agreement. And it was interesting to look at because they set theirs up much differently than mine. And to be perfectly clear, given what's happened in the real estate industry over the last 2 years with regard to the NAR settlement, etc., commissions are 100% negotiable. All right. And I want to say that up front because I'm going to be talking about percentages, and they are not necessarily, I'm not saying those are what the percentages are. These are just examples of what were in this contract. So I don't want to get sued over using 3% as a commission. All right. With that as background, when I looked at this listing contract, the seller was agreeing to pay a cooperating broker, that's the buyer's broker, a commission of 3%. And then when you read down further, the broker said that I'm going to negotiate the commission on the seller's behalf to try to get them a lower commission with the buyer's broker. And that sounds really good, right? If you can save 1% on $1 million, that will save you $10,000. That's significant money. However, it undermines the whole point of cooperating with other brokers in the multiple listing service. And let me explain. I'll give you some background on how it works now since the NAR settlement. If I find a property that a client of mine wants to buy, after I find out how to show it, etc., because we can no longer publish a commission in the multiple listing service, what happens is I have to ask the broker how much compensation is the seller offering to pay. And many of the big houses on Oahu will say, my client is negotiable. Okay, so let's go back to the listing agreement I just reviewed. The seller has agreed that they're going to pay 3%. They're already willing to do it. But the broker is, when someone calls, is going to say the seller's negotiable on the commission. And let me tell you how that undermines the seller and potentially creates a bad situation with the buyer's agent and their client. All right? The way the multiple listing service works is we're supposed to work together, not necessarily supposed to work together, we work together to help our clients. In my case, sellers and sometimes buyers, and with a lot of brokers, it's buyers. And before the NAR settlement, we had what we call surety of being paid. Those are my words. If the multiple listing service offered 2% or 2.5% or 3% or 4%, then the buyer's broker knew that they were going to get paid. And this is the challenge that saying negotiable creates. It creates a situation where the buyer's broker doesn't know how or if they're going to be paid. And how it undermines the sale is now the buyer has to put in the contract, and the buyer's broker has to put in the contract the amount of compensation that the buyer's broker is to receive, and they don't know whether or not the seller's willing to pay it. It creates unsurety. If you were working on a project, in whatever you do, you're a carpenter, an attorney, an accountant, pick something, and you didn't know how or if you were going to be compensated for the work you're going to do, how are you going to feel about doing the work? From a buyer's side, their broker doesn't know if or how they're going to be paid. From the seller's side, we're creating a situation where the way the commission is teed up to the buyer's broker may actually undermine interest in the seller's property. Now, totally unethical alert, all right? It's totally unethical for a broker not to show a property that because of the amount of the commission. Totally unethical. However, if you're a broker or an agent and you don't know how you're going to get paid on one listing, right, versus I know I'm going to get paid on another listing, what is human nature going to do? I'll let you answer that question. Now, let's go back to my example. If the seller's willing to pay the commission of 3%, then if you're thinking about selling a property and your broker is saying we're going to call it negotiable, I'm going to recommend that you lead, that you take control of the situation. You say, absolutely not. I do not want you to say I'm negotiable on the commission. I want you to offer 3% compensation to the buyer's broker upfront, because that will take away this unsurety of how the buyer's broker is going to get paid. If you're dealing with a low down buyer, a VA buyer, someone who doesn't have a lot of money, how the heck are they going to come up with the money to pay their broker? So we take those things away from making or settling the transaction. Here's the other thing. Under the new commission arrangements from the NAR settlement, a buyer's broker can be paid no more than their buyer representation contract says they can be paid. What happens if the buyer's representation contract says 2%? Well, the buyer's broker can only be paid 2%. And so the question becomes, what happens to that other 1%? If you set it up the right way in the multiple listing service, it may create an incentive for the buyer to buy your property and help them with their closing costs. And let me tell you how you can do it. Now, we can't publish commissions in the multiple listing service. However, you can publish in the multiple listing service credits to a buyer. Buyers can use the credits for their closing costs. Their broker could be a closing cost. So you can put right in the multiple listing service, with our example, seller shall credit buyer 3% toward closing costs. And when the buyer's agent asks, or is your firm offering compensation to a buyer's broker, you can say the 3% in the multiple listing service offered to the buyer's credit is inclusive of your commission. So if no matter what your commission is, if it's 2%, 2.5%, your buyer is going to pay you out of that 3%. If there's remaining amount of that credit available, the buyer that can then use that toward their own closing costs. Are you with me so far? So let me summarize. One, you do not want to have your broker saying you're negotiable on commissions when asked. I think it undermines you as a seller, gets you less interest, it creates unsurety with the buyer and their broker and the broker alone, whether or not there's unsurety with their buyer. Number two, if you're offering to pay a buyer's broker a certain amount, then have your broker tell the buyer's agent when they come in and ask, how much is your client offering to compensate me for bringing my buyer in? And then number three, and this is the out of the box thinking part of me, not a lot of people do this, but put in the MLS, the multiple listing service, seller shall credit buyer X amount toward closing costs. And when the buyer's agent asks about compensation, your broker will say that amount is to compensate you and to help the buyer with their closing costs. Make sense? Now, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments or would like to chat with me, reach out to me in all the ways that are available to you to do so. And in the meantime, you have a great day.